What are the cons of buying an HDFC apartment? We'll demystify this topic in the following video. I'm Nick at Houseit. We can save you money if you're buying in New York City, whether it's an HDFC, condo, co-op, or townhouse through a commission rebate. Learn how by visiting houseit.com. So back to the topic of today's video, which is what are the cons of buying an HDFC? You know that they're cheaper. That's certainly attractive. But do the cons outweigh the benefit of paying slightly less for an apartment? Let's go ahead and get into the drawbacks of buying an HDFC. The first drawback of an HDFC is that it is much more difficult to finance, meaning you're going to have a harder time getting a mortgage. Now, interestingly, as a result, HDFCs tend to attract fairly wealthy people who are obviously within the income limits, but not necessarily devoid of assets. They might have a lot of cash, liquidity to their name. So a lot of the times, people start putting down 80% on an HDFC or perhaps even paying all cash. Now, as to the reasons why it's hard to finance, there are several. For starters, HDFCs often have very light budgets. You may have noticed that the maintenance fees are quite low on HDFCs. And as a result, it's very common for an HDFC to just be skating by, maybe running an operating loss on their annual financials, and perhaps having a pretty low reserve fund. Now, this can be problematic for a lender when it comes to getting the building approved for a loan. And the other reason why it's hard to get a mortgage is because of income limits. Now, oftentimes, some buildings that are on the pricier end, for example, a property in Gramercy that's, let's say, $700,000, if that building has lower income limits, it's actually mathematically impossible to stay within a lender's debt-to-income ratio maximum of 43% while also conforming to the income limits of the building. So the end result, assuming your building can get approved in the first place, is that you basically just have to take out a very large down payment or make a large down payment and take out a very small loan. And you may not be willing to do that, but that is a very common issue with HDFCs. The other reason why it's hard to get financing for an HDFC is because most of the time, the management is really hard to get a hold of. Potentially, the building could be self-managed, and this means that literally the people who live in the building, there'll be a treasurer, there'll be a president, and a lot of the times in our experience, the lender and also your lawyer as the buyer has trouble getting answers to important questions that are put forward as part of the due diligence questionnaire as they describe it before you sign the contract, or in the case of the lender, they call it the lender's questionnaire. So if the lender's not getting the answers that they need, or they're getting sort of limited documentation, disorganized materials, it lowers the odds of getting financing. So if it's harder for you to get financing, it's also going to be harder for the buyer of your apartment to get financing when you try to sell. Naturally, fewer buyers will result in a potentially lower sale price. Another disadvantage of an HDFC is that they have fairly high flip taxes. It's not uncommon to see a flip tax of 30, 40, 50% of profits. Now, keep in mind, this does vary by building. It also may vary based on the length of ownership. And also what you can deduct, as is defined by profits, does vary by building. So you really shouldn't be buying an HDFC for a quick flip. That's really not the idea. And the flip tax is one key deterrent for undertaking that type of approach. Another disadvantage of buying an HDFC is with respect to subletting restrictions. Now, you probably know that most apartments in New York City are co-ops. Co-ops are cheaper, and co-ops also have the same drawback, obviously, of restrictions on subletting. But the reality is that HDFC co-op sublet restrictions are more onerous, almost always, than a traditional co-op. Another issue or con with buying an HDFC is governance issues. And we alluded to this earlier. What do we mean by this? Well, a lot of the times these buildings are chaotically managed, to put it mildly. There is potentially no manager. Given the low budget, they might not even be able to afford a management company. And even if they do have a management company, there's no guarantee that it's a good one because there's a limited budget. So who can you hire for such a low budget? So as a result of questionable governance, buildings are oftentimes in poor shape. They might not get routinely inspected. As a result, there could be a lot of deferred maintenance. This could hit your wallet in the form of assessments, higher odds of an assessment with a building that's not really properly managed versus one that's really iron down all its maintenance and is being proactive and so forth. And then also in terms of governance issues, it's not just about the condition of the building, but it's also just about your lifestyle when you're there. Let's say something happens. Let's say you look up and there's like a flood coming from the ceiling. You need to contact management. There might not be management. It could be self-managed. And you have to call your neighbor. What if your neighbor's on vacation? So it's just a little bit more chaotic, I would say, to potentially live in an HDFC. But in all fairness, it could be the same way for a non-HDFC building that is on the smaller end. There are plenty of non-HDFCs, both condos and co-ops in New York City, that are self-managed. And keep in mind as well, self-management could also be really good. So we don't want to generalize, but you do need to be a little bit more careful when looking at an HDFC to make sure that you're not getting into bed with potentially poor building management and all of the headaches that could unfold as a result. And finally, another con of buying an HDFC is the risk of regulatory changes adversely affecting the value of your apartment. Now, HDFCs are obviously more regulated than normal apartments, and the specific risk that we're alluding to in this case is that in the future, should HPD, New York City Housing Preservation and Development, try to put more onerous rules in terms of stricter income limits, maybe asset limits for purchasers, and other restrictions, once you've purchased based on the regulatory framework today, if the regulatory framework 5 years from now is way more restrictive, in theory, that would mean that the value of your property, value of your home, your asset, will basically go down. And the risk here is much more acute for an HDFC compared to a traditional co-op, condo, or any other type of property in New York City for that matter. So just to summarize, when you're buying an HDFC, a couple of key risks to keep in mind. It's harder to get financing, pretty high flip taxes, pretty onerous subletting restrictions, a lot of governance issues in terms of like the building's condition, how it's managed, and finally, the risk of regulatory changes adversely affecting the value of perhaps what is your most valuable asset. So we hope you found this to be helpful. If there's anything we've missed, please do let us know, and keep in mind, you can use our closing calculator on our website, houseit.com, to estimate your closing costs, and then you can reduce those closing costs by working with us by way of the buyer agent commission rebate that we would be happy to offer you at closing. I'm Nick at Houseit. Please get in touch. We'd love to help, and we'll see you on the next one.